That is Toccata and Fugue in D minor by German composer Johann Sebastian Bach. And this is the history of the modern-day vampire. Before we begin, due to the nature of this topic, I want to make a quick disclaimer that we will be discussing vampire folklore, myths, and historical accounts, some of which may include dark themes such as death, blood, and violence, as you may have guessed from the topic of vampires, and viewer and listener discretion is advised. Vampires have become one of the most beloved creatures in the fantasy genre, capturing the imagination of millions through books, movies, tabletop RPGs, anime, and video games. Where does the idea of the vampire come from? And how does garlic, steaks, fangs, aristocrats, and so many more classic vampire tropes make their way into fantasy? We are going to travel across the ages on a timeline and take a look at all these questions and what today's media has adopted. Before I begin, I want to mention that there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of different lore about vampires, spanning many different cultures and time periods. I have attached a link to a PDF version of the book Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology by Teresa Bain in the description, which has around 600 variations of vampiric folklore. In order to not get carried away on different tangents, we will follow a timeline I think is one of the most relevant to the rise of the modern-day vampire. And as we go along, we will check off traits on a table that we find in our vampires of today. Feel free to add folklore or fun facts that I miss in the comments. If you are watching on YouTube, I have everything timestamped if you're looking for anything in particular. Ready? Let's begin. Antiquity. One of the earliest records we have is found in ancient Mesopotamian mythology around 4000 to 2000 BC. The region that made up ancient Mesopotamia can be found in Iraq and parts of Iran, Syria, Turkey, and Kuwait. The Ekemu, or also known as the Edemu, were restless spirits of people who died horrible deaths or whose funeral rites were not given. They were known to be incorporeal in nature and very bitter or angry, relentlessly attacking the living. Once the victim is dead, the Ekemu would possess the living and sometimes even manipulate their actions. Their howls could be heard during the night, and it signified incoming misfortune or death. To do so, they would drain the life force of their victims. Another reference during this time period is the mention of a demoness woman named Lilitu, which is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Hulupu tree. I won't go much further than that, as the idea of Lilitu, as well as her name, changes dramatically depending on the time period, civilization, and reference you look at. The name Lilith might be more familiar, especially if you're a Marvel's fan. These beliefs continued even in the 1500s BC, and we have evidence of that. Letters between the Assyrian king Dasarata and the Egyptian king Amenophis III were found and transcribed in 1892, which contained evidence of the belief in these supernatural beings during the 1500s BC. Author Teresa Bain, in her book Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology, on pages 7 and 8, gives us more details. Quote, dating from around 1500 BC, these letters discuss the arrival of envoys and ambassadors. What makes the letters so valuable is that they contain 500 lines of Akkadian and Babylonian ideas regarding the belief of witches and malign spirits that haunt mankind. The article even translates into English for its readers' pleasure most of an incantation used to exorcise a demon, as well as a complete translation for a brief magical formula for use against 10 different types of devils, including Lilith and Ekemu. I hold aloft the torch, set fire to the images of Utuku, Skedu, Rabusu, Ekemu, Lamastu, Libason, Akahaza, Lila, Lulitu of the maid Lilu, of all that is hostile that attacks me. May their smoke mount heaven. May their sparks cover the sun. May the priest, the son of the god Ea, break their spell. End quote. The next most well-known precursor is found in ancient Greek mythology. The Empusa, Lamia, and Mormo were specters who shape-shifted into beautiful young women to attract young men and feed on their blood and flesh. Lamia had a serpent's lower half instead of legs. The Empusa had flaming hair with one leg made of brass and the other the leg of a donkey. The Vrikolakas is similar to the Empusa, Lamia, and Mormo, in that it was another creature that was undead that feasted on humans. This one is really hard to follow though, as a lot of scholars disagree on exactly what that belief was. In ancient Greece, it was more of a ghoul or a zombie that focused on eating livers at night. Later on, it changed to an undead that knocked on doors of houses, calling on the names of those inside, and then left. It would move on to the next house if the door wasn't opened. If someone did open the door, that person or someone within that house was cursed or attacked, becoming another Vrikolakas. If 2 or 3 knocks occur on a door, it is safe to assume that a human is knocking on your door, as the Vrikolakas did not have the patience. It would also suffocate people while they slept, by strangulation or by sitting on them. Others argue that Vrikolakas were werewolves, while others argue that they were vampire and werewolf hybrids. The confusion lies in the very similar and overlapping words across different regions and languages. The Greeks also had, and have, 12 different words for a vampire, which adds more confusion. Lastly, we read in Homer's Odyssey that the undead could not be heard by the living unless they first drink blood. Odysseus visits Hades to consult with the blind prophet Tiresias on how to safely return home to Ithaca. After performing a ritual and spilling the blood of a lamb and goat, the undead swarm around him. Reading from Book 11, lines 150 to 155, quote, "So saying, the spirit of the prince Tiresias went back into the house of Hades when he had declared his prophecies. But I remained there steadfastly until my mother came up and drank the dark blood. At once then she knew me, and with wailing she spoke to me in winged words, 'My child, how didst thou come beneath the murky darkness, being still alive?'" End quote. Let's compare these ideas to our modern-day vampire. Here is the chart we're going to use that lists as many popular traits and tropes that I could find. There are probably a few missing, and feel free to toss them in the comment section. Let's take a look at this chart real quick before we begin. We have the date or the year that we're looking at. So right now we're looking roughly around 2000 plus BC up to 1500 BC we did mention for Mesopotamia. Civilization and regions. We're currently looking at the Greek and Mesopotamian names that we find. We covered the Enemu, the Utuku, the Lamia, Empusa, Mormo, Lilitu or Lilith, and Vrikolakas. So let's do a comparison. Birth of a vampire. In Greek mythology, the Empusa, Lamia, and Mormo were all created from the pantheon. Vrikolakas and Enemu became undead based upon improper or desecrated burials, tragic and or untimely deaths. The passing on of vampirism from one creature to another is only mentioned in the case of the door-knocking Vrikolakas. So looking at our chart, magic, and I'm thinking more of magic rituals, necromancy, things like that you would find in modern-day vampire tropes. We do not see that in the Greek or Mesopotamian mythology. Bitten or turned. Turned is just, if you're not familiar with it, turned is just another term used for someone being bitten rather than being born, which we'll go to in a sec. So bitten and turned we find with the Vrikolakas. So we can check that one off. Born. Born is a very interesting one. We're not there quite yet. There could be something outside of what we have looked at, but I could not find any solid evidence of vampires being born. So that's going to be a no for us here. Science. Science is more sci-fi fantasy that you would find in something like Marvel, using some kind of scientific concoction to turn oneself into a vampire or another person to a vampire. We do not obviously see that yet, so that's a no. Next up, we have appearance. Under the category of appearance, it varies greatly depending on which civilization we are looking at, as mentioned before. Incorporeal spirits seem to be the most common. I also want to mention fangs in particular. Apart from the more serpentine creatures, vampire-like creatures of the ancient day were corpses or spirits, and no mention of fangs will be found. A lot of other traits like glowing eyes, slender frame, etc. will all come in later through history. So taking a look back at our chart, under appearance we have a pale appearance. That one's actually going to be a no, surprisingly. We'll get to that in a little bit. Fangs is going to be a no. Red or black eyes that you would commonly see in drawings or pictures of vampires, that's also going to be a no. Slender is going to be a no. Cape, nope. Aristocrat, not yet. That's coming in the Victorian era. So no traits or tropes actually in appearance are going to be here, which is kind of interesting. All right, moving on to powers. As far as powers are concerned, we saw that the Greeks in particular believed in creatures that shape-shifted into beautiful women, while Mesopotamia civilizations believed in creatures that took over or controlled people. Both civilizations believed that these creatures could curse or cause death or bad luck. There is no mention of shape-shifting into a bat just yet. Looking at our chart, we have strength and enhanced senses I'm going to put together. I haven't found enough conclusive evidence that strength and enhanced senses in the form that we see them today in vampires occur in mythology. The only thing I can think of is the Greek mythology and whatnot, more monsterish like, and you could have the, say strength and enhanced senses. But as far as corpses or whatnot having that, I just could not find enough evidence of that. And this is going to be a question mark for me personally, these two. Could say yes, but I'm just going to leave them as a question mark. Immortal or ageless, not so much during mythology time period, definitely later on. Regeneration. Regeneration goes almost hand in hand with immortal, ageless. That's also going to be a no. You don't see that in ancient mythology. Mind control, that we definitely do see. We just talked about that with the Vrikolakos. So that is going to be a yes. The shapeshift is going to be yes for the Lamia, and well, all of the Greek really, with the shapeshifting into beautiful woman. Flight, spirit-like, yes, I will say that. The spirit-like ones hover or whatnot. Wall climb, I don't see it. It'll be coming, but not yet. Controlling of nature, not yet. Controlling animals. So nature is more of weather, and controlling animals is more of speaking to animals to do your bidding. And you don't see that in ancient mythology. Curses, absolutely. Bloodlines of being from a specific bloodline or family, a vampiric family or clan, you have more power. That does not come up. That actually doesn't come until way later on. So that one's going to be a no. Sorcerers, in some pockets, maybe some sort of sorcery, seduction, sorcery kind of mixed in together. But as far as like doing magic and whatnot, I would say no. So this is going to be a no for me. Native soil. The native soil theory is that vampires need to, if they're going to go anywhere, they need to bring home soil with them. And we do not see that in ancient mythology. So that one's going to be a no as well. Behavioral. The trope of a seductive vampire that lures its victims to their demise can be seen in the case of Dampusa, Lamia, and Mormo. But in this case, the victim is completely consumed rather than just drinking blood. These creatures are also nocturnal and associated with the underworld, but This will change as the ages go by. So looking back at our chart under behavioral, seduction is a yes. Next one is nocturnal or diurnal. Diurnal isn't really used as much, so if you don't know what diurnal means, that means active during the day, whereas nocturnal is active during the night. And that's going to be a yes for us. Counting is the next one. That one is more ritualistic in ancient mythology. Looking at something like the Vrikolakos that would knock once and then leave. Counting had to do with a lot of rituals concerning the dead. This is going to change a bit as we get going along in later ages, but counting is a yes for us with the Vrikolakos and the how many times it taps on the door. And there's a few other things, but as what we have mentioned, we'll do counting for the Vrikolakos. Neck bite is the next one. This is actually surprisingly untrue for mythology. This one is a no. They would, the creatures of this time, the vampires of this time, would either eat just the liver, like the Vrikolakos, or would completely consume. There is no bite. Invitation, that's a very popular one, a very interesting one. In the sources I was looking at, there was a lot of, it could have been a precursor this, it could have been a precursor that. There was no specific, you had to let these vampires in. That's going to come up later. But with the Vrikolakos in particular, with the knocking, why would it knock? There seemed to be some kind of precursor there of let me in kind of thing. So I'm going to say yes for invitation. But as far as a vampire needing to be let in, that is not going to be showing until later. Clans and families, this does not show up yet. That will show up later, but definitely not now. And what I mean by clans and families, that goes along with the bloodlines. Well, first and foremost, the behavior of being in a clan or family until later. And the bloodline goes hand in hand with that if you're from a particular clan or family that's more powerful than another. So this doesn't show up until way later. The coffin mythology, you didn't really have coffins. You just buried the dead in the ground. So this coffin picture isn't going to be showing up until later. So that's also going to be a no for us. Blood drinker. This one is going to be a yes as well. The Greeks in particular, especially in Homer's Odyssey, had the idea of the undead drinking blood in order to talk to the living. Weaknesses. So how does one kill that which is already dead? Good question. In regards to the incorporeal spirits, exorcism, prayer to the gods, and a proper burial could stop attacks. In other cases, we run into very familiar concepts. Fire and beheading was the most common method of destruction. Another very common method is using a stake made out of what is considered a sacred wood, such as hawthorn, ash, and oak. These woods were considered to have purifying properties that could cleanse evil spirits and were associated with anchoring the body or spirit to the earth. Large stones were used in ancient Greece to stop the corpse from rising. Iron had a very similar purifying effect and would help in anchoring the corpse into place. These ideas are kept and built upon when we reach the 16 to 1700s and beyond. The popular idea of silver does not come up yet. First up, we have daylight. Daylight is not a weakness amongst vampires in mythology. Holy water and the cross is not going to show up until later in history. You could argue maybe anything that is holy during that time period could be considered for this category, but I do have exorcism down here. So I'm just going to say no for this. We'll get to that one later on for sure. The wooden stake is a yes, more so in just ancient civilization folklore in general, the wooden stake and the ideas behind it. It might be a little bit later on from this time period that we have, but that is definitely one of the oldest of these weaknesses. Garlic is a no. So the thought of garlic, a vampire staying away from garlic, if you hang garlic around your neck or whatnot, that will keep vampires away. That doesn't show up until later. So that one's a no. Silver is also a no. We're going to see that one later on. Mirrors is also a no. There is some thoughts on mirrors later on, but for right now, that one's going to be a no. Native soil as being a weakness rather than a behavior. I did toss it in twice because I think there's a little bit of a difference here. This one is more of a thought of a vampire is more powerful in its homeland, but it's also at its weakest point because of the connection between the two worlds, or whatever the belief may be, is where the vampire resides. That one we're not going to see now, but we're going to see that one later. Running water. That one's going to be a no for now, but it will come up later on. Beheading is a yes. Fire is a yes. Invitation, again, this one's a double, but I put it in as well. It could be weakness, and I'm going to say that one's going to be yes because we talked about that already. And last but not least, exorcism is also a yes. This establishes for us a base upon which other ideas arise or are changed as we move forward. There are also some mentions of undead in the medieval ages, but it really isn't until the 1500s and later that specifically vampires are the biggest threat. Witches and witch hunts are more common during the medieval age. But before we get there, we need to look at Vlad Dracula III, also known as Vlad the Impaler. Between the ancient time period that we briefly looked at until now, there have been folklore stories passed, supernatural beliefs and practices, tales of witches, succubi, demons, and such, but nothing really solid for us to look at. That is until a certain individual is born, Vlad Dracul III, or by his nickname, Vlad Tepesh, Vlad the Impaler. This man has been the center of many vampire stories, so I think it is necessary to cover his story. A little bit of context is needed to understand where the name Dracul comes from before we dive into Vlad the Impaler. Vlad II, his father, was brought up in the court of Sigismund of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. He made Vlad II a voivode, or a military leader, of Wallachia, nestled between the Transylvanian Alps in the northeast and the Danube River in the south. While not a nation itself, it was allowed its own rulers and religious practices. Sigismund also made him part of a chivalric order that Sigismund had created called Order of the Dragon, that was formed to defend Christianity from the Ottomans, earning him the moniker Dracul, which means dragon in Latin. Some of you may be familiar with the Order of the Dragon if you've ever played Age of Empires 4. This moniker was passed down to his sons, and A is added to the end of a name to signify the son of, so Dracul became Dracula. Vlad Dracula III's life was one of constant war. Wallachia was sandwiched between the nation of Hungary in the north and the powerful Ottoman Empire in the south. Dracula had to deal with enemies on both sides and from within as the two powerful nations spread their influence far and wide. John Hunyadi of Hungary, Mehmed II, the conqueror of the Ottoman Empire, who took down Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire. In order to fend off the more powerful enemies, cunning was necessary, and Dracula had plenty of it. Aside from being a brilliant strategist, Dracula used impalement of his enemies and their families as a fear tactic to dissuade them from taking over Wallachia. His enemies painted him as a monster, to try to turn the masses against him, giving him the nickname Vlad the Impaler, which, to be fair, impalement is very cruel and grotesque indeed. One particular event that is portrayed in a woodcut picture is Dracula dining amongst the impaled bodies of his enemies at an execution site in Brasov. His enemies quickly spread the legend that he dipped his bread in blood. The most notable event is when Dracula impaled the bodies of 23,844 Turks and lined them next to the road in the capital city of Wallachia, Târgoviște. Mehmed II and his army walked into the open gates of the city to a, and I quote, forest of the impaled, end quote. Mehmed II took his army and left the next day. The Ottoman Empire was never able to take Wallachia while Vlad Dracula III lived, and in that sense, he is seen as a hero to his people. We will revisit Vlad the Impaler when we talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula, but for now, this man helped fuel the growing vampire ideas and superstition and inspires later literary works. If you are interested in more information about Vlad the Impaler, there are plenty of good YouTube videos, podcasts, and books on him. I put a link in the description below. The next important step in our timeline lands us in the 1500s. A question pops into mind regarding Vlad the Impaler. Why him? Why is he the prominent figure of vampire stories? Before I did my research, I had always just thought it was because he impaled his enemies as a reference to the wooden stake and because he was a cruel man. Vlad was not even close to the first person who impaled people, though. The earliest record we have of impalement as a form of execution for prisoners of war or crimes was in 1772 BC by Babylonian king Hammurabi, roughly 3,200 years ago. Persia and Rome did the same. The connection to staking a vampire is loose at best, as the reason for using a wooden stake has its own connections. What about his character? Vlad was ruthless to his enemies, but kind to his people. A mixture of a captive upbringing, constant fighting, and survival amongst powerful nations led to this. There are men more cruel than him across time and nations. So again we ask, why Vlad? Other than the connection in Bram Stoker's Dracula, which we will cover in part 2 of this series, I suggest a few reasons. Number 1. While impalement has been used for thousands of years, no one has impaled more people than Vlad, hence the moniker, Vlad the Impaler. Using impalement as a signature fear tactic, Vlad the Impaler impaled an estimated 40,000 to 100,000 people throughout his lifetime. Most were prisoners of war, dead or alive. This terror leads us to number 2, propaganda. With enemies surrounding him far and wide, Vlad Dracula becomes Vlad the Impaler, who dines on the blood of his enemies. This is both helpful to Vlad and also a curse as his enemies grew. Number 3, place. This region of the world has one of the strongest connections to vampire legend and accounts, which is why vampires are thought to be mainly Slavic myth and folklore. From here on out, aside from the book of Daemonologie, this is where we will be staying for the rest of part 1. And number 4, time. Superstition abounds, and witch hunts are common appearances. Creatures that lurk in the cover of the night, and common folk turned evil are spoken about throughout the generation. When books are written about vampires, researchers and authors alike find themselves within the time period of Vlad Dracula and later. Speaking of the book of Daemonologie, King James VI of Scotland, who later becomes King James I of England, writes a dissertation on demons, witches, and such like in 3 volumes in 1597. Witch hunts were already frequent during this time period, some of which King James attended himself. In his preface to the reader, He talks about how he wishes to enlighten the reader about the dealings of witchcraft and its existence. This shows the amount of fear and superstition that existed up to the 1500s. This dissertation helped spread the fears and superstitions of the people to a broader audience and uses persuasive arguments on their existence. I attached a link to the ebook version if you want to read it. 1600s, the Bloody Countess. Countess Elizabeth Báthory was a countess of Exed, Hungary. I apologize, I cannot pronounce Exed correctly. Báthory is important to us for several reasons. 1. The legends surrounding Báthory paint her as a vampire. 2. This is still in the same region as Vlad Dracul III, with a focus on Hungary, which links everything nicely for us when we get to the vampire hysteria in the 1700s. The Báthory family was incredibly powerful and wealthy, and her uncle on her father's side was Voivode of Transylvania, while her uncle on her mother's side was Polish King Stefan Báthory. The Báthory family even loaned money to the Habsburg monarchy, which was a very powerful family that ruled Austria, Hungary, and many other regions from 1282 AD to 1918 AD. This is the same family that had several members become Holy Roman Emperors and also became the Austrian-Hungary Empire in 1804. This is the same family that still ruled during World War I. Keep this extraordinary amount of wealth in the back of your minds as we will come back to it soon. Elizabeth was married to Count Ferenc Nadasdy at the age of 15. Ferenc was almost always away at war against the Ottomans, and it fell to Elizabeth to defend and rule the estate. Elizabeth proved herself to be more than capable of this duty, but was a cruel master to her servants, the young woman in particular. Perhaps this was due to the influence of her husband, who was known to cruelly torture Turkish prisoners of war, and legend has it that it was he that taught her how to torture people at a young age. After her husband's death, Elizabeth became even more cruel with the promotion of the servant Anna Dervoya, who perhaps taught her more cruel methods of inflicting pain. Elizabeth's favorite torture methods were supposedly needles under the fingernails and using a claw to slash the face. Any laziness or clumsiness was met with severe punishment. Many of her servants ended up dying, which may have seemed suspicious, but unfortunately, the life of a servant wasn't much during this time period. Young women of nobles started to come to her estate to be taught etiquette from a very powerful and highly esteemed family. It is when these young nobles started dying that investigations began. In 1610 to 1611, she and 4 of her servants were accused of torturing and killing 80 to 650 female servants and noblewomen. Her servants were tried and either executed or sentenced. She herself, being a noble, was imprisoned in her castle until she died 4 years later. Modern scholars have recently cracked open the case to see whether Elizabeth and her servants really did kill all these young girls. The evidence was vague, and the head investigator had much wealth and land to gain on her incrimination. Whether or not she committed the crimes, her image was fictionalized around 100 years later to depict her bathing in the blood of young virgins to keep her youthful countenance, and earning her the nickname, the Bloody Countess. Just like Vlad the Impaler, her story inspires many works of art and literature down the road. I have attached a link to 2 YouTube videos in the description below on Elizabeth Báthory. One focuses more on the alleged crimes, while the other is more historical and unbiased, but both are most enjoyable for sure. With all this important background, we get a picture painted for us of a region ripe for an incoming vampire panic. We have historical figures showcased in vampiric characteristics and rumors being spread far and wide in the Slavic region and beyond. This may now connect the dots for us, if we have ever heard of the modern-day vampire stemming largely from Slavic folklore. Everything we have talked about so far has been in this area. During the 16th to 18th centuries, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria all make up the Slavic region. It is of no surprise, then, that we find ourselves with our first ever recorded vampire, Jure Grando, in 1656 to 1672 of modern-day Croatia. If you are immediately picturing a pale-faced and nimble man wearing a cape and fanged smile, I'm sorry to disappoint. Vampires of folklore are very different from modern-day vampires, as we see in fantasy. To stay on point, we will go into greater detail on folklore superstition later. The stories, however, are very interesting indeed. Jure Grando Alevic was a stonemason that lived in the region of Istria, which is in modern-day Croatia, with his wife and 2 children. He died in 1656 from some sort of illness. For the next 16 years, the villagers would tell stories of how Jure would rise from the grave and terrorize the village. Many people claim to have seen him, including his widowed wife and the local priest who buried him. Legend has it, he would knock on doors of the villagers, and one of the inhabitants of that house would die in just a few days, similar to the Greek Vrikolakas that we looked at. Attempts to drive a stake made of hawthorn through his corpse's heart failed, as they could not pierce his skin. It finally ended after he was beheaded by one of the villagers. It is said that he screamed as the blade bit into his skin. The legend of Jure Grando was just that, more legend than any believable tale. It made some small waves throughout the region and influenced some writers later on, but it wasn't until the 1700s that multiple cases would pop up in succession and were being well documented. The 1700s Vampire Hysteria. This is when 2 vampire hysterias, or vampire panics, swept through southeastern Europe, Transylvania, and even made it further west. The first vampire panic was from the late 1600s to the 1700s, and the second vampire panic was between 1720s and 1750s. It was during this time that the words for vampire, upir, vampti, vamiti, vampire, strigoi, striga, strizga, were translated into English in 1732 and added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 1741. The reason for this hysteria is a culmination of many things: post-war, disease, and superstition. With all these combined, the idea and panic of vampires spread all over the region like wildfire. So to understand this, we need to look at the power struggle in the region during this time period. The Ottoman Empire had ruled since 1299 AD, but during this time period, it started to decline, facing conflicts from within and from without, mainly at war against the Habsburg monarchy called the Ottoman Habsburg War from 1526 to 1791 AD. The Peace of Passarowitz, 1718, gave some of Serbia and Wallachia into the hands of the Habsburg monarchy ruling from Austria. Austria now has a stronghold on the area, and we have regions with mixed people, beliefs, and cultures. Soldiers would return home with stories, tales, and rumors, spreading them far and wide. The land and its people need to rebuild and look to heal their war-torn areas. This leads us to the next ingredient in the recipe for disaster: disease. With the war and mixing of people from different regions, diseases started to spread. I'm only going to mention the diseases that pertain to our topic at hand. Rabies is the first on our list. Amongst many symptoms, there are a few we want to take a deeper look at. The number one symptom we need to note is madness. Hallucinations and aggressiveness contribute to the superstitious fears of seeing things that didn't really happen, as well as random attacks of aggression. Another major symptom is that swallowing is very painful. Instead of swallowing their spit, the poor fellow ends up foaming at the mouth. I will mention that hydrophobia, fear of water, is another symptom that leads to those infected. But the belief that vampires can't cross running water stems more from old mythology that running water is pure and therefore will cleanse the undead. There is some fact in this, however, as we know that running water is cleaner than stagnant water. Next up, we have smallpox. Smallpox is highly contagious, and those who manage to survive it are left with small to debilitating scars. You can imagine then that seeing someone die of smallpox with strange scars would strengthen the belief of vampires. In the 1700s, smallpox was also known as the speckled monster disease. Tuberculosis. I can never say that word. Or TB, as it's much easier to say, is a bacterial disease that attacks mainly the lungs and is spread through the air. The coughing and spitting of blood made this bacteria seem very responsible for vampirism. The next two diseases are both blood disease or blood infections, which are highly significant to what was believed as one of the causes of vampirism. More on how one becomes a vampire later. First off, we have syphilis, which is a STI. Syphilis creates bleeding sores all over the body, including the face and the gums. Bleeding mouth, you say? Interesting. Syphilis can also lay dormant and reemerge later. Like the first vampire case with Ure Grando, other vampire cases reported people dying quickly and almost randomly. Like rabies, mental and bodily decline leads to sickly-looking people with possible random seizures. Lastly, syphilis can be passed down from mother to unborn child and to a baby during feeding. Babies are also reported of being victims of vampires and becoming vampires themselves. This would explain some of the seemingly random deaths of babies. The second blood disease is porphyria. Those who suffered from this disease had a pale look to them and would make their teeth bigger because the disease also affected the gums, causing them to shrink. People with this disease also had severe skin reactions to sunlight and had to cover up or stay out of the sun. While later nicknamed the vampire disease due to sharing similar characteristics to the modern-day vampire, folklore vampires are actually quite different, as we will see now. But porphyria did still have a place in folklore, just not quite how we would think. Something to keep in mind, as I briefly mentioned during this section, is that these diseases mainly contribute to vampiric folklore due to how fast they can kill, how they are spread, and for unrecognized symptoms. Scientific discovery and treatment of these diseases had not caught up yet. Using porphyria as an example again, I mentioned the shrinking of the gums. Well, folklore vampires didn't have fangs, so that symptom is more of an oddity rather than a specific connection. When you have unexplainable strange things or oddities, some kind of explanation needs to be said, and in our case, vampirism is the explanation. We will come back to this after looking at some case studies. Superstitions. In order to understand the superstitions circling around at this time, let's look at our case studies first, before we dive back into our table. There are two case studies that we need to look at, not only because they are insightful, but they have a huge impact on the spread of the vampire hysteria. Serbia was passed from the Ottoman Empire into the hands of the Habsburg monarchy. What makes this case in particular very important is that it is the first incredibly detailed report filed about vampirism, and it is filed by an official of the Habsburg monarchy. Since Serbia is newly under the rule of the Habsburg family, This would be one of the first times that folklore is being witnessed by an outsider, and the disconcerting news of vampires roaming around your empire is something that needs investigating. In order to really bring us back in time, I'm going to read an excerpt from Vampires, Burial, and Death, page 6, which Paul Barber takes from Domestication Mortorum by Michael Ramft. Quote, after a subject by the name of Peter Plogojovitz had died, 10 weeks past, he lived in the village of Kisilova in the Rom district, and had been buried according to the Ritzian custom. It was revealed that in the same village of Kisilova, within a week, 9 people, both old and young, died also, after suffering 24-hour illness. And they said publicly, while they were yet alive, but on their deathbed, that the above-mentioned Plogojovitz, who had died 10 weeks earlier, had come to them in their sleep, laid himself on them, throttled them, so they would have to give up the ghost. The other subjects were very distressed, and strengthened even more in such beliefs by the fact that the dead Peter Blogojovitz's wife, after saying that her husband had come to her and demanded his own ponky, or shoes, had left the village of Kisilova and gone to another. And since with such people, which they call vampires, various signs are to be seen, that is, the body undecomposed, the skin, hair, beard, and nails growing. The subjects resolved unanimously to open the grave of Peter Plagojevitz and to see if such above-mentioned signs were really to be found on him. To this end, they came to me, and, telling of these events, asked me and the local pope, or parish priest, to be present at the viewing. And although I at first disapproved, telling them that the praiseworthy administration should first be dutifully and humbly informed, and its exalted opinion about this should be heard, they did not want to accommodate themselves to this at all, but rather gave this short answer. I could do what I wanted, but if I did not accord them the viewing and legal recognition to deal with the body according to their custom, they would have to leave house and home, because by the time a gracious resolution was received from Belgrade, perhaps the entire village, and this was already supposed to happen in Turkish times, could be destroyed by such an evil spirit, and they did not want to wait for this. Since I could not hold such people from the resolution they made, either with good words or with threats, I went to the village of Kisilova, taking along the grasped pope, and viewing the body of Peter Plogojevitz, just exhumed, finding, in accordance with thorough truthfulness, that first of all I did not detect the slightest odor that is otherwise characteristic of the dead, and the body, except for the nose, which was somewhat fallen away, was completely fresh. The hair and beard, even the nails, of which the old ones had fallen away, and a new fresh one had emerged under it. The face, hands, and feet, and the whole body was so constituted that they could not have been more complete in his lifetime. Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth, which, according to the common observation, he had sucked from the people killed by him. In short, all the indications were present that such people, as remarked above, are said to have. After both the Pope and I had seen this spectacle, while the people grew more outraged than distressed, all the subjects, with great speed, sharpened a stake, in order to pierce the corpse of the deceased with it, and put this at his heart, whereupon, as he was pierced, not only did much blood, completely fresh, flow through his ears and mouth, but still other wild signs, which I pass by out of high respect, took place. Finally, according to the usual practice, they burned the oft-mentioned body in hot kusu to ashes, of which I informed the most laudable administration, and at the same time would like to request, obediently and humbly, that if a mistake was made in this matter, such is to be attributed not to me, but to the rabble, who were beside themselves with fear. Imperial Provisor, Grest District. End quote. It should be mentioned that the Imperial Provisor, Ernst Frombold, is not a doctor. It can be seen in the recorded account that he mentions otherwise characteristic of the dead. He knows the basics of what one would normally observe about a corpse, but nothing descriptive of a doctor's personal take. This is a great example for us, however, to see that what we have discussed prior concerning the appearance and signs of vampirism and how to deal with the body is recorded for us. This record was published by a Viennese newspaper called Venir Aish di Arium, along with the next case we're going to look at. One can imagine the amount of publicity this drummed up. Have you seen this week's newspaper? Apparently there has been a vampire attack in Kisilova. Look, look! It's signed by the Imperial Provisor himself. Arnold Pohl. Our next case also has some very useful information for us. I'm not going to read the account, but summarize it instead. For the full report, see the link in the description below, or search Arnold Pohl or Visum et Repertum, seen and discovered. What makes this case so special is that a group of army surgeons are now sent to investigate another vampire case. Oh yes, the doctors are here. Arnold Pohl was a Serbian Hajduk, or an ex-freedom fighter, who believed he was being stalked by a vampire. In order to ward the vampire off, he ate soil from the supposed vampire's grave and smeared his blood over himself. Alas, these wards did not prove to be effective, as he was killed by a vampire in 1725. Just kidding. He fell off a hay wagon and broke his neck, the poor guy. Roughly 30 days after his death, other people in the same village started to claim they were being troubled, and 4 were killed. He was dug up, found to have the same undecomposed state as Peter Plagojevich, staked through the heart, burned, and his ashes thrown back into the grave. Here is where it gets even more interesting, especially for us in our hunt for the pop culture traits that modern vampires exhibit. The 4 people that he was claimed to have killed started to trouble the village as well. Well, that's a problem. As mentioned, this belief and variations of this belief were always around, but this is the first time that the belief of vampires creating more vampires is recorded and shown to the world. To add to this, the report also mentions that more vampires were also created through the eating of cattle that the vampire fed upon. In a period of 3 months, 17 people from old to young died within 2 or 3 days of symptoms. All were dug up and observed to be in different states of decomposition or barely at all. Those with vampiric characteristics were dealt with accordingly, and the others were laid to rest again. Let's talk about the fact that 5 army surgeons were watching this as previously noted. Personally, I find it really hard to tell exactly what the thoughts are according to the sources read. This was originally written in German, and all sources have roughly translated into other languages, including English. It seemed to me that they are definitely perplexed. The undecomposed state of the bodies stumped them like everyone else we have mentioned before. They approve of the methods used in dealing with the supposed vampires, but I don't see anywhere where they themselves truly believed it. But neither did I see them actively denying the claims. There are other accounts and reports of doctors watching the digging up of bodies and denying the claims with explainable facts or theories. Have a look at it yourselves and let me know what you think in the comments. Either way, this was also published in the same newspaper and spread abroad, with, mind you, the signature of 5 army surgeons. I want to give another example, this time on the Greek island of Mykonos, to give a different perspective on cases like this. This time, the case was observed by French botanist Joseph Piton de Tournefort in 1718. He was not the least bit convinced of Mykonos' Vrikolakas. Reading from page 21 to 24 in Vampires, Burial, and Death, quote, "We saw a rather different and quite tragic scene on the same island occasioned by one of those corpses that are believed to return after their burial. The one of whom I shall give an account was a peasant of Mykonos, naturally sullen and quarrelsome, a circumstance to be noted concerning such matters. He had been killed in the fields, no one knew by whom nor how. 2 days after he had been buried in a chapel in the town, it was bruited about that he had been seen walking during the night, taking long strides. They came into houses and turned over furniture, extinguished lamps, embraced people from behind, and played 1,000 little roguish tricks. At first, people only laughed, but the matter became serious when the most respectable people began to complain. Even the popes acknowledged the fact, and doubtless they had their reasons. People did not fail to have masses said, but the peasant continued his little escapades without mending his ways. After a number of meetings of the town leaders and of the priests and monks, they concluded that it would be necessary, in accord with I don't know what ancient ceremony, to wait till 9 days after the burial. On the 10th day, they said a mass in the chapel where the body lay, in order to drive out the demon that they believed to be concealed in it. The body was disinterred after the mass, and they set about the task of tearing out its heart. The butcher of the town, quite old and very maladroit, pause for a second, maladroit means ineffective or clumsy, continuing on, began by opening the belly rather than the chest. He rummaged about for a long time in the entrails, without finding what he sought, and finally someone informed him that it was necessary to cut into the diaphragm. The heart was torn out to the admiration of all the bystanders. But the body stank so terribly that incense had to be burned. But the smoke, mixed with the exhalations of this carrion, did nothing but increase the stench, and it began to inflame the minds of these poor people. Their imagination, struck by the spectacle, filled with visions. They took it into their heads to say that a thick smoke was coming from the body, and we did not dare say that it was the incense. People kept calling out nothing but "Vrikolakis" in the chapel and in the square before it, this being the name they give to those supposed revenants. The noise spread through the streets as if it were being roared, and this name seemed to be invented to shake the vault of the chapel. Several of the bystanders claimed that the blood of this unfortunate man was quite red, and the butcher swore that the body was still warm, from which they concluded that the deceased had the severe defect of not being quite dead, or, to state it better, of letting himself be reanimated by the devil, for that is exactly the idea they have of a Vrikolakis. They caused this name to resound in an astonishing manner, and then there arrived a crowd of people who professed loudly that they had plainly seen that the corpse had not become stiff when they carried it from the fields to the church to bury it, and that as a result, it was a true Vrikolakis. That was the refrain. I do not doubt that they would have maintained that the body did not stink if we had not been present. So stunned were these poor people from the business, and so persuaded of the return of the dead. As for us, who had placed ourselves near the cadaver to make our observations as precisely as possible, we almost perished from the great stench that emerged from it. When they asked us what we thought of the deceased, we answered that we thought him quite adequately dead. But because we wanted to cure, or at the least not to irritate their stricken imaginations, we represented it to them that it was not surprising if the butcher had perceived some warmth in rummaging about in the entrails, which were putrefying, that it was not extraordinary if fumes were emitted, just as such emerge from a dung heap when one stirs it up. And as for the pretended red blood, it was still evident on the hands of the butcher that this was nothing but a stinking mess. After all our reasoning, they were of a mind to go to the seashore and burn the heart of the deceased, who in spite of this execution became less docile and made more noise than ever. They accused him of beating people at night, of breaking in doors and even roofs, of breaking windows, tearing up clothes, and emptying pitchers and bottles. He was a very thirsty dead man. I believe that he did not spare any house but that of the consul, with whom we lodged. However, I have never viewed anything so pitiable as the state of this island. Everyone's head was turned. The wisest people were struck like the others. It was a regular illness of the brain, as dangerous as madness or rage. One saw entire families abandon their houses and come from the outlying areas of the town into the square, carrying their pallets, to pass the night there. Everyone complained of some new insult, and there was nothing but groans at the coming of night. The most intelligent ones withdrew to the country. In so general a prepossession, we chose not to say anything. They would have treated us not just as fools, but as infidels. How is one to bring an entire population back to its senses? Those who believed in their soul that we doubted the truth of the matter came to us to reproach us for our incredulity and claimed to prove by authoritative passages taken from the Shield of Faith of Pere Richard, a Jesuit missionary, that there was such a thing as a Vricolacus. He was a Latin, they said, and therefore you should believe him. Nor should we have gotten anywhere by denying the conclusion. They made a scene every morning by a faithful recitation of the new jests committed by this night bird, who was even accused of having committed the most abominable sins. Those citizens who were most zealous for the public good believed that the most essential part of the ceremony had been deficient. The Mass should not have been said, according to them, until after the heart of this unfortunate man had been torn out. They maintain that with this precaution, the devil could not have failed to have been surprised, and that without a doubt he would not have returned. Whereas, in starting with the Mass, they said he had had all the time necessary to flee and to come back afterward at his convenience. After all these reasonings, they found themselves in the same difficulty as the first day. They meet night and day, debate, and organize processions for 3 days and 3 nights. They oblige the popes to fast, and one sees them running among the houses, the aspergillum in their hand, sprinkling holy water and washing the doors with it. With it, they even filled the mouth of this poor Vricolacus. As they recited certain prayers, after having planted I don't know how many naked swords in the grave of the corpse, which they disinterred 3 or 4 times a day, according to the caprice of whoever came by, an Albanian, who happened to find himself in Mykonos, took it upon himself to say, in professorial tone, that it was extremely ridiculous to use the swords of Christians in such a case as this. Can you not see, you poor blind people, he said, that the guard of these swords, forming a cross with the handle, prevents the devil from leaving this corpse? Instead, why don't you rather use Turkish sabers? The opinion of this clever man was of no use. The Vricolacus did not appear to be any more tractable, and everyone was in a strange dismay. They did not know which saint to call upon, but with one voice, as though they had given one another the word, they began to cry out, throughout the village, they had waited too long. It was necessary to burn up the Vricolacus entirely. After that, they defied the devil to return to set up quarters there. It was better to resort to such an extreme than to have the island deserted, and in fact, there were already whole families who were packing up, with the intention of retiring to Syra or Tynos. So then, they carried the Vricolacus, by the order of the administrators, to the tip of St. George's Island, where a great funeral pyre had been prepared, with tar, out of fear that the wood, as dry as it was, would not burn fast enough for them on its own. The remains of this unfortunate cadaver were thrown on and consumed in a short time. This was the 1st of January, 1701. We saw the fire as we returned from Delos. You could call it a true fire of rejoicing, for one no longer heard the complaints against the Vricolacus. They were content to observe that the devil had certainly been caught this time, and they composed a few songs to ridicule him. In the whole archipelago, people are persuaded that it is only the Greeks of the Orthodox Church whose corpses are reanimated by the devil. The inhabitants of the island of Santorini are terribly afraid of such types of werewolves, and the people of Mykonos, after their visions had dissipated, were equally afraid of prosecution by the Turks and by the Bishop of Tynos. Not a single pope wanted to be present at St. George when they burned the body, out of fear that the bishop would exact a sum of money for the having exhumed and burned the deceased without his permission. As for the Turks, it is certain that, at their first visit, they did not fail to make the community of Mykonos pay for the blood of this poor devil, who became in every way an abomination and horror to his country. End quote. Superstitions. Once again, we can do some comparing and contrasting with our modern-day version of vampires. A lot of the beliefs that we discussed in the ancient civilizations have rooted themselves and have been built upon before we reach this time period. Birth of a vampire. One thing I should mention here is that vampires are no longer seen as incorporeal spirits, but corpses coming back to life. On top of improper or desecrated burials, tragic and or untimely deaths, superstition expanded the ways one could become a vampire. One of the most interesting ways of becoming a vampire was when any animal walked, jumped, or flew over a grave. A cat or dog was usually the culprit. At first glance, this had me puzzled. It seemed like a random way for the birth of a vampire. It wasn't until I started reading the Slavic and Bulgarian beliefs about a person's soul that pieces started to come together for me. I'm not going to go in depth into the many different beliefs of the soul, but just the ones that pertain to what we know of vampires. In of itself, this is a bit tricky since vampires stretch across different cultures, but I'll try my best. According to the beliefs of the time, when a person dies, the soul is said to exit the body and either pass on or roam. Anything that would disrupt a soul from either escaping the body or re-entering the body can be cause for vampirism. This is why when an animal moves or flies over a grave, a vampire can be born. The animal severs the connection between the corpse and the soul. In other European beliefs, one would pour out water between the corpse and where the person died. One more thing I should mention is that souls were believed to communicate in dreams. This is quite an ancient belief in general, but we can see this in the case studies. Ure Grando, Peter Plogojovich, and Arnold Paul all came back and troubled family members during sleep, and the individual would report being attacked. Nightmares weren't seen as nightmares, but communication from the dead. With this in mind, we can go back to the other ways vampires are born. Like ancient folklore, untimely deaths and incomplete burials and a lack of a proper burial ritual are thought to disrupt the soul's journey, ending in trapping a soul inside the corpse, or allowing evil spirits to enter in. Or if something was left undone in life due to these things, the soul will try to come back. Another way one can become a vampire is through predestination. If someone was born with irregularities, or even born as the seventh son, that individual will become a vampire when they die. Predisposition. If someone was evil in life, considered to be a witch or sorcerer, then their corpse would become a vampire. Turned. The most iconic way of spreading vampirism through a bite is here. However, it isn't a bite to the neck, but a bite to the chest. Because vampires were believed to suck the blood of their victims, it would make the most sense for them to target the heart. Lastly, I want to mention actually being born and living as a vampire. The only way I have read about this is being a half-human, half-vampire, a dhampir. There are a few ways of becoming a dhampir. 1. A pregnant woman is bitten by a vampire. 2. A male vampire has sexual relations with their widow. 3. If a pregnant woman's husband dies and becomes a vampire. Or 4. A vampire turns a baby by feeding on them. Dhampirs were natural vampire hunters because they were believed to be able to see and sense their invisible vampire relatives at all times, but otherwise lived normal lives and were indiscernible from everyone else. Let's take a look at our chart. Under the date, it's the 1600s to the 1700s. Our civilization or regions is the Slavic region. Names, Upir, Upire, Vampire, Strigoi, and many, many others. Alright, birth of a vampire. First up, we have magic. And unless I've missed something, which is entirely possible, I didn't see any strong evidence of any magical rituals or black magic that is being used to make a vampire. So that one's still going to be a no. Bitten or turned is definitely a yes. Being born, this is the first time we're going to see a vampire, well, half vampire, being born, and that's through the Dhampir. Science, not yet. That one is still coming up, but there is no scientific concoction that can turn anyone into a vampire. Appearance. First, we need to be able to find a vampire before a grave can be dug up. There were a couple of ways to find a vampire. Since we already mentioned it, a Dhampir would be your go-to. If no Dhampir is around, an animal that has keen senses like a horse will become uncomfortable in the presence of a vampire. Stallions would be led through graves until one of them spooked it. If no animals are around to sense a vampire, looking for recently disturbed soil shows the movement of a recent vampire. This one is a good connecting thought for us because people who are considered evil were usually not buried properly or hastily in a shallow grave, which is a great snack for any nighttime scavenger. Lastly, if all else fails, look for a colored flame hovering over the grave. When a supposed vampire's grave is dug up, there are telltale signs that give away that you aren't really dead just yet. If you have ever been embarrassed before, you will find that your face starts to turn red. This happens because the blood vessels in your face start to widen or dilate, letting more blood circulate and relaxing your muscles. In English, we also use the word flushed. Paul Barber, in his book Vampires, Burial, and Death, states that, quote, "The Serbians, referring to a red-faced, hard-drinking man, assert that he is blood red as a vampire. And both the Serbians and Slovaks denote a hard drinker as a volkodlak," end quote, or werewolf. It was thought then that logically, if a vampire is filling its body with blood, it should appear red or darker. Not only has the complexion changed, but the body too. The corpse will appear bloated and barely decomposed because it is full to bursting with blood from its nighttime activities. If the body also had blood near the mouth, ears, or nose, there would be no doubt. Regrown hair and nails, as mentioned in the case of Peter Blagojevich, are also signs of vampirism. But what is fascinating to me is that there is still no mention of fangs. When researching this topic, I thought that surely fangs would be early, right? But this is the complete opposite to what we picture now of a pale, slender vampire with fangs. We will dive deeper into that when the belief changes. This obsession with blood makes sense considering the amount of blood diseases that were killing people, as already mentioned, as well as the ideas from ancient times being the foundation stones that these superstitions were built upon. Back to our chart under the category of appearance. First up, we have a pale complexion. We just learned that vampires do not have a pale complexion, usually a red color that is due to the amount of blood from their nighttime snack. Vampires do not have fangs yet, surprisingly. They are still just normal teeth. Red or black eyes, there are no mention of that. Being slender, that is also going to be an opposite. We saw that the bodies are usually bloated due to the amount of blood that the vampires drink. There are no capes yet, and an appearance of looking like an aristocrat is still a no. Though I will say here that sometimes a vampire will appear to have a burial shroud over them, because the burial shroud was used in burials at this time. So there are accounts of, if someone sees a vampire, it's actually almost like our Halloween costumes now that we have of having white sheets, and you cut out the eyes, the holes for the eyes. Yeah, it's the same thing, that they would have a burial shroud over them as they're walking along if you happen to be able to see them. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But still, it's a no for the aristocrat look. Once again, the powers of vampires are not as plentiful as modern day vampires. However, more powers have been granted to them by this time. Most notably is shape-shifting into animals. In the book Vampires of the Slavs, author Jan L. Perkowski writes on page 295, quote, "According to circumstances, it can turn into various animals, such as an ox, a dog, or a male sheep, then return its original form." End quote. Other references mention vampires turning into bees, and most notably, dogs or wolves, which makes sense, since the word for werewolf, volklock, is used back and forth with different variations of the words for vampire. Related to this, on the page before, Perkowski writes, quote, "They believe that there is a hole, chimney, in the grave where the deceased has turned into a vampire, and it is through this hole that he has escaped in this horrible form." End quote. I was wondering how a vampire would dig its way out of a grave and then rebury itself after a night's work. In the case where an animal has dug it up to get to the corpse, I could see the confusion, but if the grave looks completely undisturbed, I couldn't picture how it could be done. This idea of having a small hole that a vampire shapeshifts out of makes it more palatable to believe. Of course, when fear takes hold, nothing is outside the realm of possibility. There are also some brief mentions across sources of vampires being able to control the weather, but it is more to do with blaming a vampire for natural disasters rather than a vampire summoning the weather for its own use. Being cursed is a more common power that usually leads to death. Looking back at our chart under the category of powers, first up we have strength, and strength is a really tricky one to look at. Supernatural strength, I haven't really seen anywhere. Strength of a vampire is more of an assumption because it can break whatever it wants and it can overtake any person. That a vampire is usually considered to be strong, but I couldn't find anything particular to enhance strength. So that one's going to be a no. Next up, enhanced senses. Again, there's more of just kind of being able to track its prey, that vampires have enhanced senses, but I couldn't really find any direct quotes or anything like that, so that is also going to be a no for me. Immortal or ageless, that's going to be a no. Regeneration is also going to be a no. Mind control, also a no, which is kind of interesting because you had that in the ancient times, ancient beliefs, but not here. Shapeshift, that is a yes for sure this time. Flight is going to be a no. Wall climb is going to be a no. Control of nature is more of a maybe than anything else. I'm going to say no. But again, various diseases and crop failure and whatnot were blamed on vampires. Controlling animals is also going to be a no. Curses is going to be a yes. I didn't have any specific quotes for that one, but across my research, it seemed that curses were still a thing. Bloodlines. This one, I didn't see much really at all. Sorcerers. This is also going to be a no. I thought for sure there would be something on sorcerers at this point, but I didn't find much of anything. Native soil theory. Same with this one. This doesn't show up yet either. Behavior of a vampire is one of the hardest things to track down, as it varies greatly depending on where you are. All sources agree, however, that one of the first things a vampire would do is visit relatives. Male vampires, in particular, would have the need to lie with their widowed wife or a young lady from the village if they weren't married. In relation to the belief that nightmares were visits from the dead, this makes sense to me. A grieving widow would have nightmares about her late husband and interpret it as an attack from a vampire. Other than this, vampiric activities range from wandering around to violence. Some regions believe that vampires drink blood merely to survive, while others see it more as purposeful attacks. Villages hit the hardest by disease will have the more aggressive vampires, because many people are died due to the illness. Vampires are more commonly known to be active during the night, but some believe that they are also roaming during the day. In both cases, your average person can't see them unless you put your hand on your hip and look through the hole you have created between your body and arm. Perkowski describes different ways one can see a vampire, but beware, seeing a vampire comes at the risk of death. Reading from pages 299 to 300, quote, "In Lasani, any man could see a vampire providing that Dampier handed him his shirt, having taken it off in the place where he is hunting a vampire, and that curious fellow looked through its sleeve. The same result would be achieved by looking under the arm of a sorcerer, or through the sleeve of his shirt, when he is performing some of the preliminary acts of magic for the destruction of a vampire. But as a consequence, if the man did see the creature, he would suffer from malaria for 3 years afterwards, and ultimately die. However, if the magician had allowed somebody to take a look, and that person died of fright afterwards, he would be obliged to pay compensation to the man's family. A vampire can be seen by a twin brother and sister born on a Saturday who wear their drawers and shirts inside out." End quote. Clothes and looking through things seem to be a common connection, but I don't have solid reasoning as to why this is a common theme. As seen in the Greek Phrykolakos and Mykonos, vampires can cause mischief by smashing things or stamping around rooftops. Other than the natural creaks and groans of a house, people use the idea of a vampire to cover their own acts of mischief or even crime, blaming the vampire instead. This was seen in the account of Mykonos, where the youngsters were caught and eventually let go. Lastly, vampires will attack and drink the blood of domestic animals, which, if eaten, will turn the consumer into a vampire upon death. Looking back at our table under the category of behavioral, first up we have seduction. This one's going to be a yes for us, but not in the sense that you would normally think. The seductive vampire that seduces young women so that the vampire can feed upon her blood is not here yet. This is more of a vampire wanting to go back to his widowed wife. Next up, we have nocturnal and diurnal. Both are true. It can vary a little bit, but both of them are believed in the region altogether. So that one's going to be a yes. Counting. Counting is a very interesting one. We haven't talked about it yet. That's going to go in the weakness section. I probably should have switched these around, but already did one of these, so I'm just going to leave it as is. But counting is a yes for us, and I will go into that a little bit later. Neck bite. That one is a no for us. It is not biting of the neck. It is a biting of the chest, where the heart is. Invitation. This one's going to be a no. So this is where it varies from the ancient mythology, where you kind of had a precursor with the knocking Phrykolakos. Here, I don't really see any reference in the sources that I looked at of needing to be let in. So this one's going to be a no. Living in clans or families, this one is a no. Coffin, yes and no. Coffins still aren't widely used. It's more of a burial shroud. So this whole idea of needing to go back to your coffin or sleeping in your coffin and whatnot is going to be a no. It would be sleeping in a grave, yes, but not a coffin. Blood drinker, yes, this is still true. The main focus is the drinking of blood. So when a vampire is discovered, what do? Patripaics are rituals, practices, and things that ward off some sort of evil or bad luck. While this is a fitting word for vampires, I'm going to use weaknesses instead, because I'll be doing the same for other creatures from the fantasy genre. One of the most iconic weaknesses of the vampire is daylight. We have seen many instances of vampires being nocturnal, but there is actually no reference to a vampire dying or running away in direct sunlight. However, the scenes in movies of destroying a vampire while they sleep during the daytime still holds up to folklore, as we saw in the cases that we read. What about garlic? The idea of garlic scaring away vampires actually comes from some truth. Garlic contains a compound called allicin, which is a powerful antibiotic that would make the symptoms of porphyria worsen and essentially kill a vampire. So people with porphyria would stay away from garlic. The other thought is just the overwhelming smell of garlic would be too much for a vampire. And there are various cases of people using anything with a foul smell to protect themselves. I personally think that the strong smell is more likely the reason. The idea of stakes made from sacred woods is still carried over from ancient beliefs. It was seen that staking a vampire through the heart not only killed it, but saved the soul. Beheading and burning were also used for the same purpose, cleansing or severing the unholy connection. Sometimes heads would be buried somewhere else or at the feet and filled with garlic, consecrated soil, or bricks to stop the vampire from biting as an extra measure. It can also be seen as stopping the spirit from returning to the corpse. Sometimes the corpse is turned over so the face is towards the ground, stopping the soul from leaving or entering the mouth. Skeletons found with bricks in their mouths dating back to this time period and other outbreaks were found in Venice, Poland, and other parts of Eastern Europe. This idea of preventing a vampire from doing something is put into practice in a number of different ways across different regions. The corpse can be bound, nailed, pinned, put in a different position other than horizontal. If not directly impeded, a set trap will do the trick. Metal daggers, sickles, and or nails would be placed in varying positions to stop a vampire from leaving the grave unless it wanted pain and death. For example, placing a sickle at the neck so the vampire would behead itself when sitting up. Another trap used was spreading seeds, millet, or sand on the ground, or hanging a fish net over your door. Counting and compulsions had a significance to rituals with death in the afterlife, and perhaps a less known vampire weakness. It was thought that the vampire would have to stop and count these traps so he could capture it, or make a quick getaway. What about the cross and holy water? This is one that you probably guessed already, but vampires are seen as unholy abominations, and anything that is considered holy, like holy water and the cross, would be able to purify or kill a vampire. These two stem more from the Christian beliefs during this time period. Remember that we are talking about the region of the Holy Roman Empire, Ottomans, and everyone in between. What about mirrors? Mirrors themselves were not as important as anything that can capture a reflection, like water. If a corpse saw its own reflection, then either someone in the room would die, the soul would return to the corpse as a vampire, or the soul would be trapped in whatever source was giving the reflection. Ever hear of a camera being able to capture your soul? It's a similar idea. At this point, the question could be asked, why bother with all these different methods? If burning works, why not always just burn a corpse? Other than religious practices, rituals, or beliefs, the practicality of burning was not as easy as one may think. Quoting again from Vampires, Burial, and Death, quote, "Because of the high water content of the average adult human body, the energy requirements for cremation are high. The problem, in brief, lies not in creating a hot enough fire, that is easy, but in conveying about its destruction." End quote. The destruction of corpses, while related to our topic, is not something I want to dive deep into, or have on my Google search history. Lastly, I want to mention that other than burning vampires, the idea of them turning into ashes upon being destroyed does not yet exist. Looking back at our table under the category of weakness, first up we have daylight. And once again, this is going to be a no, which is very surprising on how important this one is in later vampire or modern day vampires. The holy water or cross is going to be a yes this time around due to the Christian beliefs and some of the other beliefs that are around at this time. Wood steak, that's going to carry over from ancient times. That one's going to be a yes. Garlic, or really anything with a foul smell, is going to be a yes. Silver is still a no. Mirrors. This one you could probably go either way with. However, in my study, mirrors was not clumped together with all the other things you could do to ward away or destroy a vampire, so I'm going to say no for this one. Native soil theory is going to be a no. Running water is going to be a yes. We talked about it when we were talking about mythology and ancient beliefs and why running water was seen as something that cleansed evil things. And this time around, it's actually going to be put into practice. Beheading is still a yes. Fire is still a yes. Invitation, again with the Greek Phreakolakis, is why I said yes to invitation before, but this time around is going to be a no. And exorcism is also still a yes. Vampires were blamed for all sorts of diseases and deaths of both livestock and people. There were many accounts of individuals who died, and then other people of the same village would suddenly die. These diseases came quickly, spread like wildfire, and left before anyone knew what to do. Graves were opened and inspected. Priests and doctors alike were called to inspect the bodies, would proclaim vampirism. What else could it be? There is no clear explanation, and fear is a great motivator. The vampire hysteria got so out of control that the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria herself sent out her personal physician to look into the claims. He concluded that vampires did not exist, and laws were passed by the Empress to prohibit opening graves and desecrating bodies. Other than fear and superstition, this hysteria was fueled by a lack of understanding of body decomposition and of some diseases during that time period. The book Vampires, Burial, and Death by Paul Barber that I have been quoting goes over explanations of the common vampire characteristics. I would describe it here, but the topic of the natural decomposition of the body makes me a little queasy. I will mention this though. Blood from lungs can be released at some point during decomposition, explaining the fresh blood sightings at the mouth, ears, and nose. Also, bodies decompose at different rates, and factors like the temperature have to be included in figuring out how long it takes. Lastly, gas created by bacteria will make a body bloated and sometimes can create a bioluminescence glow over a grave. This of course does not spell the end of vampires. No, not at all. Next time, we will look at the Victorian era and how other areas like the City of London take vampires to the next level. We will dive into great literary works, including Bram Stoker's Dracula, and see how the image of a vampire was changed forever. I want to leave off with this thought. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of those people living during this time period. You live in a small village where everyone knows each other's name and who bakes the best cookies. Unfortunately, one of the village's farmers has fallen ill. A few days later, he dies. Fast forward a few days and another person falls ill and dies. Soon, everyone you know and love is falling sick and dying very quickly. How do you respond? What do you think? One of the villagers mentions something about a vampire. Could that be true? Rumor spreads until, finally, it is decided to bring the local priest and doctor in to take a look. Corpses are unearthed, and you can see fear starts to creep into the faces of those around you. Isn't the body supposed to be decomposing faster? Is that fresh blood? Fear, paranoia, and superstition take over and whip everyone into a frenzy. It's a vampire, someone shouts. A vampire? A vampire! Makes its rounds around the grave. And so begins the vampire scare. Headlines in the newspapers, word of mouth, and stories traveled from soldiers in the war and travelers. How scary it must have been to witness the death of so many around you and have absolutely no idea on how to stop it and what to do. something is at fault, or perhaps someone.